and exactly how thick that curtain was between the public's business and the people elected to do the public's business. They spent the time, the effort, and quite frankly, the money to detail exactly how thick that curtain is. The results, I think you would agree, are pretty spectacular. Within days of their series publishing, all of a sudden it seems like every legislator in Kansas decided that transparency had to be the thing. We're going to have press conferences to tell you how we're going to change that. This is abominable. Now, no one had ever said that in the last 20 or 30 years, but now all of a sudden that light was shed on the lack of transparency. There needs to be transparency in the legislature from a legislative viewpoint. Let's take that all the way to this morning, when our 10-day-old governor for 10 days, not a 10-day-old person, signed 4 executive orders this morning, inviting the Kansas Press Association to stand with them as he did, all dealing with transparency. Things like no more government private emails for government business, only government emails only. A dashboard online for the public to see what the legislature is doing. 4 things like that, well, he didn't say so. It's quite obvious that was an absolute direct result of what the Kansas City Star exposed. So tonight, we have the Star here, and we have some legislators here to talk about transparency, to talk about what needs to be done, and talk about what can be done. I'm so glad to see you all here. I'm glad you have an interest. I'm glad you took the time to come out and join us. And on behalf of the Kansas Press Association, I welcome you. And now I give to you our moderator, Tony Nelson, editorial page editor of the Kansas City Star.
Thanks so much for joining us here tonight at the Capitol Plaza Hotel in Topeka, and thanks to the folks who are watching at home on Facebook Live. And I also want to thank the Kansas Press Association for partnering with us on tonight's event. Our discussion is part of the Star's continuing efforts to report on government secrecy and track efforts to make Kansas government more open. The Star launched this conversation with a consequential series in November that exposed the links government officials have gone to keep information private. Everything from shredding documents, shredding notes in the Department for Children and Families, to obscuring the authors of bills in the legislature. I want to start tonight by introducing a few folks from the Star, including some of the reporters and editors who worked on the series. Mike Fannin, the Star's editor, is here tonight. Greg Farmer, the Star's managing editor, is here. And Star reporters Laura Bauer, Judy Thomas, Hunter Woodall, Kelsey Ryan, and Andy Marceau are here tonight. And Leah Becerra, an audience editor at the Star, is here. She'll be monitoring the questions we receive on Facebook tonight. So let's dive in and meet our esteemed panel. Tonight we'll be talking with Susan Wagle, Senate President and a Wichita Republican, Jim Ward, the House Minority Leader, a Wichita Democrat and a candidate for governor, Laura Kelly, a Democratic Senator from Topeka and a candidate for governor, former State Representative John Rubin, a Republican from Shawnee, Representative Jason Probst, a Hutchinson Democrat, and Don Heinman, the House Majority Leader and a Dighton Republican. Now we're going to tackle one basic question tonight. What should be done to make Kansas government more open in the future? We want to focus on solutions, and I'm going to press each of you on the panel to tell us what you will do to improve transparency in government. We asked people in the audience to submit questions in advance, and we'll give some folks in the audience a chance to share their concerns with our panel. And if you're watching at home, you can leave questions in the comment section on Facebook. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground and hit several different topics tonight. If we don't get to your question, I'll save some time for the end, and we'll come back to folks in the audience for some more questions. But let's start with the question of what can be accomplished in this legislative session. The buzzword in Topeka these days seems to be transparency. A lot of legislators have been rushing to propose and support bills that open the process. But there's also some skepticism that any real change is not going to happen, and that it's all just talk at this point. We haven't seen many hearings scheduled in committees for the transparency bills that have been introduced, and there's a fear that leadership will refuse to let them advance. Senator Wagle, let's start with you. what needs to happen for these bills to become laws? And are we just having a conversation that won't amount to much change?
First of all, let me say that in the 2016 election, my Senate Republicans and I stood up for the Better Plan in a very big press conference, and we said each letter stood for something, and T stood for transparency. We took action at that time to make sure that the committee minutes had those people who wanted the bill, who made the motion, who asked for the bill, their names were in the record. We made sure that 2 days notice was given before any bill ever had a hearing, so that people would have time to drive to Topeka and engage in a hearing. A full day before we debated on the floor. We took a number of transparency initiatives. We put our committee hearings, we put them all on live audio. And we put the Senate chamber, that didn't get done till this year, on live audio and video. So transparency is not something new to us. It's something that we've worked for a long time. I've been elected for a very long time, and let me assure you, in the 90s when I first came in, there were no ethics laws, and there was nothing, there were no regulations about when you could give a legislator a campaign donation. You could walk in and lay a check on the desk right before a vote came up. So seeking transparency is something that we need to constantly do. It needs to be something that an objective that we all have as our types of communication changes, as technology improves. And it's something that you're always looking at and always improving. I just went through a situation where a number of newspapers came out about sexual harassment in the Capitol. And as I worked with the Women's Foundation to resolve that issue, they said, Susan, resolving sexual harassment and making your environment a better workplace is a process. It's a process over time. You improve your policy, you improve education, you improve awareness, and you pass bills and you do things to make sure the environment is free of sexual harassment. The same is for transparency. It is a process, it is awareness, it's making improvements as technology changes. And we've been involved in that, and certainly we took a stand in 2016 as a Senate caucus.
Representative Ward, is anything going to get done this session? You seemed skeptical when we talked earlier.
First of all, I want to thank the Kansas City Star for putting this event on. I want to thank them for doing their series of articles that supercharge transparency. And I'm tired of hearing the process has to work. We need action now. We can pass bills this year. I'll name 4 that could happen this year, and I think they passed both chambers with big numbers. 1, it should go in the law books that you can't introduce a bill anonymously. You've got to put your name on your work. 2, it should go in the law books that you can't introduce a bill in committee in secret. You have to put your name in the minutes so it's trackable who asked for a bill in committee. 3, we should stop the revolving door of legislator to lobbyist, executive director, or chief of staff of the governor to lobbyist, and we should put a cooling period in immediately that says you have to lay out 1 year after leaving public service before you can come back as a lobbyist. The federal government rarely does things better than we do in Kansas, but here they're ahead of us. It takes a year before you as a retired or beaten congressman can come back, or 2 years for a senator. 41 states have a cooling off period, 26 use 1 year. We don't need to wait any longer for those kinds of bills. There's a DCF bill that I introduced last year before the articles. I think Laura's here. She and I were talking about this 3 years ago. If a child's killed in custody of the Department of Children and Family, if a child is sexually abused while in custody with the Department of Children and Families, we should get those records out so people can review them and ensure that everything was done to protect those children. And if they're not being protected, we fix the problem. Now, we've got to comply with federal law, but we can be a whole lot more open than we are today. And we don't have to wait for the process to work. We just need to put the bills on the floor and vote on them, and that's what we should do.
Senator Kelly, what needs to happen to get some of these bills moving?
Well, I think we have to have the cooperation of leadership. They dictate what bills move when, either through the chairs of committees where the bills may be planted, or if a bill gets out of committee, then leadership are the people who will decide if that bill actually comes to the floor for debate. So we really have to count on our leadership to move those things forward. I think the legislature as a whole is ready, will, and able to have a robust discussion the other thing that we need to do, we're talking a lot about what the legislature ought to be doing, but I think another area of transparency where it's a problem that's become very obvious over the past few years is within our agencies. You know, we have had the DCF issue, Department of Children and Families, that Representative Ward talked about. I mean, not only do we need to make sure that we can get the information about deaths or serious incidents within our Department of Children and Families, we need to have an independent investigative unit to look into those kinds of incidents to see what really happened, not rely upon the agency where it happened to give us proper information. I would spread that out to a lot of our institutions. Yet in our prisons, we know we've had a number of issues. In our prisons, we were not informed that any of that kind of stuff was going on until it was really hard. In fact, I think until the media uncovered that. And we've had the same kind of thing going on in our state hospitals. So I think it's sort of an across-the-board thing we need to do. The legislature has a lot of work to do, and where we can do that, but we also need to hold the executive branch accountable.
Representative Rubin, are we just having a conversation that's not going to amount to much?
Well, Colleen, I certainly hope not. First of all, I want to join in the thanks to the Kansas City Star and Kansas Press Association for sponsoring this event on this very important topic that people across the state of Kansas are entitled to know more about. Thank you all for coming, for attending today, and those watching online as well for showing an interest in this very important topic. It's been important to me for a very long time. I'm a 30-year federal agency attorney and later a federal administrative law judge. I served in the legislature. I had the privilege of representing the citizens of Shawnee for 6 years. And this has been a core principle, a core issue of mine since the time, essentially, that I joined the legislature in 2011. Just a little bit of background about why it's been so important to me and why I tried to carry the fight on some of these issues, particularly with regard to legislative accountability and transparency as early as 2013. You know, the Declaration of Independence, our fundamental founding document, says that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And it seems to me that if the governed are not informed, they cannot adequately and fully provide consent to the operation of their government. I think it is that fundamental principle. While I was still a federal judge, there was an incident that I'll just tell you about briefly that really stoked my interest, and it was one of the reasons why I decided to retire from the bench and run for the legislature. There were a number of issues, but this was an important one. It was actually a city government operation. There was a vote in the Shawnee City Council on a tax bill. I don't remember the particulars of it even now. But at that time, the Shawnee City Council was even more secretive than it is now. It still has problems and has been the subject of complaints from the Johnson County District Attorney's Office about a lack of accountability and transparency violations of the Open Meeting Act. But at that time, some of the votes actually were secret. We found out how our state, one of our city councilmen voted on that particular tax measure before the council, and my wife called our city councilman, happened to be our neighbor, and asked her, and told her we knew that she had voted for the provision, and asked her to discuss it a little bit. And the response my wife got from that city councilwoman was, "How did you find that out? You're not supposed to know how we vote." That was a shock to my wife and to me, that anybody representing us at any level of government in the state of Kansas could possibly think that way. Well, I got to the legislature and found out that that's by and large how, at least in the House of Representatives, a lot of the votes were handled in secret without being disclosed to the public. And that is why, as early as 2013, I introduced, at that time, rather than statutory changes, proposed rules changes to both the House rules and the joint rules on a number of issues, but two significant ones. One was recording all votes, and another was to fight the practice of bundling. I'll just speak briefly about both of them. I found when I got to the House of Representatives that votes in committees, and after all, that is where so much of the statutory policy that governs Kansans' lives are fashioned, are in committee, with hearings, with very active discussions among the committee members, with amendments, sometimes many amendments proposed, votes on those amendments, votes on the bill. The way the rules in the House were and still are, hopefully they will change this year or soon, but the way the rules were is no committee members vote on any measure or amendment or bill is recorded unless the committee member asks that it be recorded. I was privileged to be named the chair of the House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee in 2013, and I attempted to institute a rule in my committee that all committee members' votes would be recorded, and I had a revolt on my hands. A number of committee members of both parties went to the House Speaker and asked to be removed from the committee if I was going to require that their votes on bills and amendments actually be recorded. Faced with that mutiny, I had to back down, and while I still strongly encouraged the practice and had all of my own votes recorded and encouraged others to do so, most on my committee did not. And to this day in the House, and I believe in the Senate as well, most votes in committee are not recorded. It's important you know how your representatives and how your senators vote on legislation when it's being crafted, when it's being formed in committee. On the House floor, there's a two-step process to pass a bill out of the House and send it to the Senate. The first step is called general orders. The second step is final action if the bill passes general orders. And most votes, I'm not going to get too far in the weeds, I'll be happy to answer questions afterward for anyone who has any. But most votes on general orders, on bills, and importantly on amendments that can substantially change a bill are not recorded unless a certain percentage of the House members actually ask for what is called a roll call vote, and then the vote is recorded, and that seldom happens. I just don't think that's right. I think all of the citizens of Kansas are entitled to know how their representatives and senators vote on all substantive measures before them. And so that is why one of the rules I proposed was to require recording of votes. And I'm pleased to see that some legislation has just recently been introduced, I believe this week, in the legislature to address those issues. I hope they get a hearing. I hope leadership in both the House and the Senate provides a hearing and works those bills. The other thing, and I'll discuss it just briefly, again, a legislative procedure. You've heard a lot, and particularly if you've read the Kansas City Star reports on transparency, you've heard a lot about gut-and-go provisions where a bill has all of its contents removed and replaced by the contents of a totally unrelated measure bill, and that is voted on. That practice is bad enough, but what is even worse is something called bundling of bills. That is where, when the House passes one version of a bill and the Senate passes another, and they don't completely agree, they go to conference. And under the joint rules of the House and Senate, as I found them when I joined the legislature, in that conference committee report could have as many additional bills, an unlimited number of additional bills that had passed at least one chamber added to that conference committee report. With the result that when that conference committee report comes out for a vote of the House and Senate, senators and representatives are voting not just on one measure, but on 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 measures lumped into that one conference committee report. But it can't be amended, and the member gets one vote on the entire package, up or down. Even if the member thinks that half the provisions are good for the people of his district, the people of the state, his or hers, or the people of the state, and the other 6 are not, you've got one vote up or down on the whole thing. I just don't think that's right. I proposed a modification of the joint rules back in 2013 to change that practice so that no more than one additional bill could be added to any bill in a conference committee. A compromise was reached to allow bundling of 4 additional bills. That's still too many, and I would hope that the legislature this year, again, with leadership's agreement to have these bills come to a vote on the House and Senate floor, to go ahead and go all the way and eliminate the practice of bundling of bills in the state of Kansas. The final thing I'll say on this measure is many states, most states, according to our legislative research on the issue, have never heard of the practice of bundling of bills, or certainly don't follow that practice, and yet they are still able to accomplish public policy initiatives on behalf of the people of their state. So if it's good enough for other states, I would like to know why we can't do it as well. So I challenge leadership to allow bills to require all votes be recorded and to eliminate bundling to come to a vote this year in the legislature.
Representative Prost, you're new to the legislature. What do you think we need to do to ensure that some of these bills become laws?
Well, like you said, I'm new here, so I'm kind of feeling my way around. And, I've covered the legislature remotely. I lived in Hutchinson and wrote for a newspaper there. I worked for the paper for 15 years. The last 10 years I did a lot of writing and wrote a lot of editorials. And I was writing about gut and go and committee bill introductions 10 years ago before it was being talked about here. But living in a prairie town out west, people weren't paying much attention. The process, I think there are a couple of things at play here. The Star doing a concerted effort to bring it to everyone's attention, that's part of the formula. The other part of the formula is a real spirit and intent among the state's leaders to have a real belief in transparency and not just pay lip service to it, but actually recognize the value that's in it. And previously when we were talking about agencies, I believe it was Senator Kelly talking about agencies, working on the reporting side, it was not uncommon to just plainly be ignored by agencies when we were asking for information. We would call and we would ask for something, we may get a call back, we may not get a call back. I was glad to see the governor sign today that the first 100 pages of an open records request are going to be free, because that was another barrier to getting records. We would call and we'd get charged with a $15 an hour research fee, plus the cost of copies, and they would take the maximum time allowed under the Open Records Act to get that information to us. We need to modernize some of these open records laws as well. We're, again, working in western Kansas, what you guys consider western Kansas. He's western Kansas, we're central Kansas, but everybody thinks we're western Kansas and Hutch. We would, and something simple, and this goes beyond, but we can do something maybe with this in the legislature. Something as simple as a jail log is an open record. That by default is an open record. If I want to see who is in jail in Stanton County, the law provides that I get to see that. And there's a good reason for that, so that we can't hold people in secret and take away their freedom without some record of that happening. And it's open record, and when we would call from Hutchinson to hear or find out who was arrested, they would say, sure, it's open record. You can drive the 5 hours to Stanton County to get it. But we have the ability to make that much quicker. That to me demonstrates that we don't really believe in the spirit and the intent of open records. And I would say some of that applies here. In the legislature, I think that, and like I said, I'm new, so I'm a little reluctant to be, at this point, I want to know the process a little better, but I'm carrying the gut and go legislation. I really don't think that legislation ought to be completely replaced with something entirely different. And when I say that, this is something that happens to people who don't know how this works internally. It's almost like the same look you get if you gave them like liver and onions to eat, unless, they curl up their nose and they're like, that happens? So I think there are things that we do, we kind of get used to it, and it becomes part of the process, and we can look at the times that it was used to bring some good about, and so we kind of justify it a little bit, but I don't think that really is being done in the spirit of openness. Otherwise, I think there are probably some other process things. I'll just say, one other thing that I think is a barrier is kind of we have a structure in the way we set up committees that does not encourage us to work together. And sometimes I think these processes that avoid transparency are used in a way to get legislation passed when we are not willing to work together for good policy. So I think to be positive, I think there's a lot of room for growth. It's on our attention now. We can talk about this, we can have some discussion. There are some good bills out there. And the other element is engagement from people. Like, if we do all this and we introduce bills and the Star has a story, and then everyone just kind of forgets about it, and they don't stay engaged, and they don't keep watching this, that's the missing ingredient in all this. People actually having an engaged conversation with the people they elect is an important part of getting some of these things accomplished.
Representative Heineman, Senator Kelly correctly notes that the fate of these bills rests largely with leadership. That's you. So what are their prospects?
Well, I want to thank the Star for bringing this issue to light. And it is an evolutionary process, as President Wagner mentioned. It's been a concern for a long time. For instance, we now have audio streaming in all the committee rooms. That didn't just happen yesterday. That's been a several-year process to plan it out and to find the funding to make that happen. The House floor sessions are now live streamed. We have a YouTube channel, so they can be archived and you can watch them at your leisure. So those are efforts that have been underway previous to the STARS series, but the STARS certainly broadened the conversation, heightened the interest, and really got us to critical mass on the issue to where enough people are interested in it and are buying into the subject matter that we will be amping up and accelerating our adoption of transparency measures. I want to give you 3 caveats. I think there's a natural tension between full transparency and due process. A very good example happened a week or 2 ago when a letter between elected officials regarding an employee was leaked to the press. And as a result of that, a longtime public employee, Dale Dennis, had his reputation questioned publicly before there was due process to consider all the facts and determine what really did happen in that particular case. That's very unfortunate. And that's the risk we run if we don't realize that there's a balance between full and open transparency and respect for due process. There's also a need to, as we look for full transparency, it can't be at the risk of disrupting the system so that it no longer functions for the purpose it's intended for. And I'm thinking in that light in regard to the gut and go process. Just know this, last session, there were 3 measures that would not have advanced to a vote on the floor if we did not have the gut and go process. And that led to creation of the Child Welfare Task Force. It led to a vote on the House floor on Medicaid expansion, and it led to adoption of a ban on concealed carry in Kansas public hospitals. None of those things would have happened in our current system if we outlawed gut and go.
So does that mean we should keep gut and go?
If we remove it, we have to adjust the system so it still is able to function. And frankly, I'm not sure how that happens. But what we can do is limit the use of gut and go and shine more light on the process when it does happen. So it's recorded where in the process the contents of a bill were stripped out and replaced with something else, and just shine a light on how that happened. Because occasionally it is a part of the process that we need. We can't afford to get to mid-May and suddenly realize we don't have a vehicle to pass an absolutely necessary tax or budget bill. We have to have a way to adopt those pieces of legislation late in the session. And if we have squandered all of our bills and have nothing to use, then it doesn't work.
I know you want to jump in here.
Yeah, if I could share some of Don's concerns. We're a citizen legislature, and we make about $10,000 a year, 8 to 10. We give a part of our lives to a 90-day legislature that we know is going to come to an end in 90 days. And we process hundreds of bills when we walk in the door. We have 125 House members, 40 senators. Everybody comes in with creative ideas, with issues that they're bringing from their district, and we have a lot of bills that we sort through. And we have to bring an end to that session in 90 days. The gut and go that Don's talking about, when you've got a bill, the only thing you can put in that bill is something that's already passed one house, either the House or the Senate. So the bill would have already had hearings. and it would have already passed either the House or the Senate, and it just got lost between the two bodies. We're also not a unicameral body. Nebraska has one body. Because we have a House and a Senate, sometimes a bill doesn't make it through both processes, and all of a sudden the Senate goes, oh my gosh, there's a bill I wanted that the House passed, and we need to really have it, and it's not passed the Senate. So that's when we've got something, and that it's called a gut and go. That's a horrible name for it, but it's actually a bill. You can't do it unless the bill has already passed one House. Now, we're going to take time to record every vote on every amendment. Most amendments are not controversial. We just had a long debate in the House. We were there until almost 6 o'clock tonight, and there were amendments that were made on bills that were not controversial. We all just said aye, and we went on. To stop and take a roll call takes a lot of time, and we have to get it recorded in the journal. So if you want votes on everything, we're going to need a much longer session, especially if you want the votes in committee. But keep in mind, a bill never becomes law unless your legislators, in both the House, the Senate, and the governor, have had a say on that bill. They either vote for it, against it, and then the governor either vetoes it or sign it. So it's not, we're not trying to hide anything from people on these votes. What we're trying to do is get out in 90 days with important bills that, and sometimes the House will have an idea, and we just didn't get to it in the Senate yet, or the Senate has an idea and the House didn't get to it.
You would
So,
just listen to us.
oh, yeah, well, you hear us, Don, but anyway.
Can I give the other side of the story? Because what the senator just said is somewhat accurate, but there have been a number of times where it's most dangerous is in committees, where they gut bills and stick things in and there's no transparency, and it hasn't passed anybody. And there have been instances where gut and go has been used on the floor. I will admit, I have used it on the floor. We used it to get Medicaid expansion on the floor because the committee process was broken and the chair wouldn't let it out of committee. But to say that one House has reviewed a bill before it's been gutted or go, that happens sometimes, but
It's
that
passed
is
one
but
House.
no, sometimes that's true. But there's a lot of times where it's gutted on the floor or gutted in committee that hasn't been passed by either House. To say
And
that
then it comes to a vote in that body. So it's coming out, it's legislation that's being brought to the body to vote on. In a conference committee, you can't put anything in there unless it's passed one body.
So I'm in the House, and I have an idea like expanding Medicaid, which I've had for 5 years, and I couldn't get a hearing, let alone a vote. I took a bill and said, that was the same topic, and said, we're gonna talk about Medicaid expansion today, okay? Now, it passed the House, and it did go to the Senate for a
That's an
vote.
amendment, yeah.
Okay, but that Medicaid expansion hadn't passed any House, but it was substituted for the bill that was on the floor. Now, you did then review it and pass it, and the governor vetoed it. But to say that before it's gutted, the ideas have been voted, that's I think the harm that Representative Probst was talking about is we can do, Medicaid expansion should be through a committee process. It should come to the floor in the normal course of business. We shouldn't put obstacles in front of it because you as a committee chair don't like it. So therefore, we're not gonna let it out of committee. It should get the public debate in the normal course. Now, I would happily give up the tool of gut and go or substitute ideas if you let the process work.
We allow the process, that's why we debate on the floor, and that's why you are allowed to make that amendment to that bill.
So we're going to come back to this. There's more to say on this subject. We definitely want to cover a lot of ground, though. I want to talk for a moment about the culture of secrecy in Topeka. In 2016, a group called Open Kansas asked legislators to sign a pledge to increase government accountability and transparency. And in the end, only 22% of the legislature signed that pledge. Senator Kelly, did you sign the pledge, and do you think there's a culture of secrecy in Topeka?
I did sign a pledge. In fact, I think I signed 2 pledges. And ordinarily, I don't sign any pledges because it commits me generally to a vote that I may or may not want to take as to what the bill looks like. But in the case of the transparency pledge, there was no doubt that it would be nearly impossible to present a bill on transparency that I would not be willing to vote for. So I went ahead and signed that particular pledge. I do think that there's some secrecy going on in the state. I think, though, to defend some of my colleagues up here, I think it's the less in the legislature than I think is in the executive branch. I'm much more concerned, quite honestly, about what's going on in our executive branch. I mean, I think we've got some good solutions to some of the easy pickings here on transparency, but it's much more difficult for us to figure out what is actually happening in our executive branch and what they're doing that may or may not be in the best interest of Kansans. You know, I just take a look at all the privatization that has gone on over the past 7 years. I mean, we know some of the big ones are trying to privatize Osawatomie. They've privatized child support payments. They've done a bunch of privatization in the Department of Revenue. And those contracts with those folks are not scrutinized. And we have a very difficult time tracking the money back to the source. You know, who's behind this and who's going to benefit from this? And we're having a very, very hard time finding it. Several years ago, many of you are aware that we privatized our Medicaid program. We outsourced that to 3 for-profit out-of-state insurance companies, essentially, who would come in and set up managed care programs in the state. We created an oversight committee. But the problem for the oversight committee, well, first I would say that when it was originally set up, we didn't have leadership that was really interested in overseeing the CanCare program. I think now we have committee leadership that's very interested in doing that. But what we're running into is the same thing that Jake was talking about in terms of getting the information. You know, even the legislature can't get the information, or if we get information, it's given to us in such a convoluted way that we can't make any sense of it. So those are real problems, and we need to set up a totally different system for contract approval and even the discussion. I think the legislature needs to be much more involved in big things like privatization, so that there can be open conversation about that, questions asked, answers gotten before we commit taxpayer dollars for years. I mean, a lot of these private contracts are for 20, 25 years. So, you know, I mean, if you look at the docking building, for instance, you know, we pretty much cleaned that building out, and we have sent those agencies all across the city of Topeka, and they are locked into 25-year leases that are probably not in our best interest, and probably end up costing us more, but taking state money and putting it in private pockets.
I'd like to jump in on that topic.
Did you sign the pledge?
I did not.
Want to
I did
tell us
not
why?
sign pledges.
That's one that I really wanted to sign, but that's just my policy, that signing pledges boxes you in, and I didn't think it was good to do that, but I certainly support the objective. We will do what we can in the legislature. We will pass legislation that improves our process. We will adjust our rules. But the administration is pretty much out of our touch, out of our control. And think about it, we're a citizen legislature. We're in town for roughly 90 days, maybe 100, occasionally 114, but hopefully never more than that. But the administration is here every day. They're the ones that make the place run. And so it depends on the culture of that administration. Is it going to be a culture of openness and collaboration, or is it going to be a culture of obstruction and deception? And Senator Kelly has mentioned some of the problems that we've had in recent years. This is fairly trivial compared to some that you mentioned, but this is another example. I'm guessing that most of you have never seen this report. The indicators of the Kansas economy. Brownback administration put this in place early in Governor Brownback's administration. It was published quarterly online for anyone to look at. It's a thick document with plenty of benchmarks of economic performance. Well, some folks started to use the data that was in this, and pretty soon it wasn't available online anymore. You couldn't find it. If you asked for it, they would send it to you. So for a couple of years, you could still get it that way. And then early in 2016, they just pulled the plug. They just quit publishing the data because they didn't want people looking at it. And that's an example of a deceptive
obstructionist administration that doesn't want people to know what they're up to, and they don't want criticism.
I'll tell you from what I've seen of Governor Collier, he's gonna operate much differently. I think there will be a culture of openness and communication and transparency. But it's up to folks like you to hold him to that, and the people in his administration. We will do what we can, but again, we're only here for part of the year. We're a citizen legislature. Most of you are full-time in the press, so pay attention to what goes on and communicate that to the public and also to us.
Yes.
I just want to, like I said, in just a few weeks I've been here, I can see that there is a stark imbalance between the legislature and what we can do, as has been mentioned, in a 90-day session with people who largely live their lives elsewhere, as farmers or teachers or whatever they do, and an executive branch, and even just the few little weeks that I've been here working on things, there's a tendency to cede some of that authority to the executive branch, or to say, well, we'll give them this authority and then we'll oversee it through Rules and Regs Committee, or we'll come back and review it. And I mean, that is part, and I think that we have to have an honest conversation with Kansas about this. We set this citizen legislature up a long time ago, and government wasn't quite as complex as it is now. And the functions of what we're doing are not nearly as complex. We're debating a bill now in one of my committees looking at cybersecurity. These are not issues that we debated or even had to consider 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But we're still using a pretty old system of government. And part of what that does, because we're not willing to balance that back to a duly elected legislature, is there's a tendency to give it to the people who are here all the time. And that's kind of what we do, and then we try to provide some oversight on that. At some point, if people want more transparency, they want a better process, and they want some better constraint on the executive branch, probably have to have a conversation about whether we shift some of that back to the legislative branch.
Representative Ward, did you sign the transparency pledge?
Yes.
Okay. Senator Weigel?
I didn't sign it, but if I could follow up with what Senator Kelly said about concerns about the executive branch. I also have had concerns, and the minority leader, Anthony Hensley, who couldn't be here tonight, and I put a bill in, a transparency bill in yesterday that I think will do more to bring transparency to Kansas government than any of the things we've already talked about. We have a bill that requires, right now, legislators, if a lobbyist is hired by any company to come ask us to take an action, whether it's pass a bill, kill a bill, put an amendment on it, they have to report to the Secretary of State that they are lobbying for this company. They have to wear their badge in their office. If they take out to dinner, they have to report how much they spent on dinner. And so far, there's a big hole in our ethics laws, and that's not required for any executive agency or the governor's office. So the minority leader and I have a bill that requires reporting, lobbyist reporting for the executive branch and judicial branch. And that's just very important when it comes to the issues that Laura just brought up about the docking building. They were going to tear it down. It was a structurally sound building. 25-year leases were signed, and we had no idea who was working with the executive branch on those leases. We had no idea who was working with the executive branch on the CanCare contracts. And if this bill passes, and I'm hopeful it will, all that will have sunshine on it, and we will all know who is working with the executive branch on contracts and on leases, and it'll bring a tremendous amount of sunshine. If you want to follow the money, and I think this bill will help Kansas know what's going on.
Colleen, may I weigh in on this?
You may.
Thank you. To answer your earlier question, I was privileged to be the initial signatory on the transparency pledge at the press conference where it was first announced, along with Democrat Representative John Wilson of Lawrence, who is no longer in the legislature like me. Like so many of my former colleagues here, I did not engage in the practice of signing pledges. For example, all of us every year get a no tax hike pledge, and even though I consistently vote against most tax increases in Kansas, not all, but most, I would never sign the no new tax pledge, but I did sign this pledge. That's how important I think the subject is. I think there are two fundamental issues when we're talking about overall openness and accountability of Kansas government, and particularly the executive branch. First, let me briefly address the Kansas Open Records Act. Excuse me. The statutory framework that dictates what can and cannot be released by state agencies, state activities, and virtually all aspects of state government is the Kansas Open Records Act. It is reviewed annually by the legislature. Both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees review that act and specifically its exemptions regularly. The federal counterpart of that is the Freedom of Information Act, and I worked with that act for many years as a federal agency attorney and judge. The Federal Freedom of Information Act has 9 exemptions, 9 general exemptions from release. The Kansas Open Records Act has 55. I would challenge the legislature this year to start in the House and Senate Judiciary Committees and bring forward a bill that can be worked in both chambers and passed this year that would be as a result of a comprehensive review of those exemptions with a view to eliminating a number of those unnecessary exemptions. More fundamentally, the problem with Kansas government and the problem with so much secrecy that we've had in Kansas government compared to other states is what I call, as an attorney, a presumption against disclosure. You can call it a default position if you like. So the default position in Kansas by federal agencies, by the legislature, by all aspects of Kansas government is that we keep things secret, and the burden is on the public, on the taxpayer, sometimes at great expense of going and hiring lawyers and going to court to sue to get those records opened. That's exactly backwards. The presumption in Kansas, in all aspects of Kansas government, these are the people's records, and they are entitled to them unless there are good, specific reasons to keep all or part of these records confidential. And there are some good reasons. Law enforcement is a good example, and I hope we get a chance later to address some specific issues with regard to law enforcement records and criminal investigation records. There are legitimate reasons to withhold release of those documents entirely or to redact parts of them. But the burden should be on the government to go before a judge, before a magistrate, which is the system we set up for one aspect of criminal investigation records, which was a bill that I wrote and worked on and carried and got passed when I was in the legislature with regard to probable cause affidavits supporting search and arrest warrants. That should be expanded to all aspects of government. The burden should be on the government agency or entity involved to go before the magistrate and state to the magistrate's satisfaction or the judge's satisfaction why a particular record needs to be redacted or sealed entirely. Otherwise, it should be released, rather than the way it is now.
I want to talk for a minute about anonymous bills. We know that the House Speaker recently ordered an end to anonymous bills, but that's a policy change, not a statutory change, so it's only a temporary fix. And Representative Stephanie Clayton has a bill that's been co-sponsored by 40 lawmakers, but some worry that leadership in both houses will thwart an attempt to ban this practice through legislation. So, Senator Weigel, let's start with you. Does leadership support
As I
this
stated
legislation?
earlier, we made a demand over a year ago that every person that introduced the bill was named in the committee minutes, so that anybody could pull up the minutes online and find out who introduced that bill.
Do you support Representative
Thank you.
Clayton's bill?
I have a bill in the Kansas Senate that requires a name to be on the bill, and I signed on that bill.
Okay.
So, we're not trying to hide anything. And I think to say that it just now became an issue, it was an issue in the Senate, 2 years ago.
Okay.
Okay.
Representative Hyman?
Speaker Reitman and I implemented the procedural policy.
How do you feel about codifying it that in law?
That's the next step. We didn't want to wait for the legislation to work its way through. We wanted to implement it now, and it's there now that in committees, whenever someone requests a bill introduction, they have to identify themselves, and that's recorded in the minutes. And also, if it's at the request of or on behalf of some third party, they have to divulge that as well. That's
we've worked with our IT staff about getting that up on the website when you pull up the bill's contents. And they assure us that they're working on that. I checked this afternoon in hopes it was there, but it's not there yet. But that's a real concern of ours, and if it takes legislation to lock that in place, I understand that. We're committed to it personally, but leadership does change.
Senator Kelly?
Well, the one thing I'd like to bring up with that, I support having people identified. It's very frustrating as a legislator to not be able to track down the source of the bill. So just from my perspective, I'll be glad to have that on. But we also need to make sure that we include in that legislation, if we don't get rid of gut and go, that the person's name who was on that original bill that was gutted gets to have their name taken off, because what's getting put in there may not be something that they are interested in sponsoring at all. So we just have to make sure we're doing both.
I absolutely think we have to put it in the law books. And I want to show you the change in culture on the House side. When this biennial session started last January, that's when we debated our rules. I brought 3 amendments to our rules. One that would eliminate anonymous bills. It was defeated. Second one was eliminate anonymous committee introductions. It was defeated. Then a third one was to do what Senator Kelly just said, which is if you take my bill and remove its contents and put something else up, that you would remove my name from that bill. It actually was passed. Why I think it's important to put it in the law books is like Don said, leadership changes, and if you can change it in the back office, you can change it back. And if it's in the law books, you have to change it out in public, and then you can put pressure on it. So it's very important that we put those changes in the law books.
I want to talk next about sexual harassment. A recent story in the Star detailed how interns in the Kansas State House are required to sign a confidentiality agreement that many worry could stifle the reporting of sexual harassment or illegal activity. I'm interested in why the House needs such a practice and what needs to happen to change it. Representative Heineman?
Well, I don't know when that policy was first drafted. I suspect it was fairly recently, a matter of years ago, but fairly recently. But it essentially was drafted in a different era. We are certainly in a different era right now in regards to the Me Too movement and sexual harassment. And as we look back at that policy, we see it's no longer appropriate. It's drafted too broadly. We need to tighten it up to make sure that that NDA only covers legislative business and not personal business, and certainly nothing with regard to sexual harassment.
Representative Probst, what would you like to see happen with that?
Well, I agree with Dawn, and I talked to, I asked my intern, I said, when after I read the story, I didn't even know that they had to sign an agreement, and I asked him about it, and he said he didn't even realize exactly what it was. But yeah, it sounds like it was probably written way too broadly. There is some value in saying, look, when you're talking with someone about legislative business, it's important that you can keep this, here. Certainly, anyone who feels that they're being violated or exploited in any way, back to this, by default, the presumption should be that that person has a right to report that without repercussion.
I want to jump now to some criminal justice issues. Several Kansas communities have had recent high-profile police shootings, and family members, especially in Topeka after the shooting of Dominique White, have fought to see body camera footage and say they can't get information from police. It's important to note that Kansas has one of the most restrictive body camera laws in the nation. And another family, Alberta and Harold Leach, who are here tonight, have battled for 3 decades to get information from police after their son Randy disappeared. What needs to be done to make sure that more information is provided to the public? And why isn't there more accountability of police in Kansas? Senator Kelly?
We have discussed body cameras several times in the course of my Senate tenure. And one of the biggest problems that we come up with is not that people are so adverse to body cameras per se, there are some, but generally people think they're fine. But it's the matter of paying for them and then storing the information. That's very expensive. And, you know, as you well know, over the past 7 years, we haven't had two nickels to rub together in the state. And we've been reluctant, I think, to pass that mandate down to our local units of government, who we've passed so many other mandates down to. So I think money has really been a bit of a problem. And then I think, you know, our local police agencies need to take a serious look and have some serious conversations about what is the purpose of a body camera, and how should it be used, and how should it be disclosed and released. I think that just there's such inconsistency across the state, actually across the nation, with that issue. And I just think they really need to sit down and come up with a system that works for everybody. I think, you know, obviously law enforcement's going to have some good arguments on their side about why they might not want to release something, but, you know, the public has a right too. And so somehow everybody needs to get together and work out a compromise that works, and maybe have it flexible enough that there can be exceptions in certain cases.
Representative Rubin, I know you have some ideas on this subject.
I do, Colleen, thanks. I alluded earlier to the issue with regard to probable cause affidavits, which is a microcosm for everything we're discussing in the area of release of criminal justice records. Excuse me. All those principles that I've mentioned before that apply to the openness, the public's right to openness and transparency in their government, I don't see why any of those principles should not apply with equal force to law enforcement. So back in 2013, when I first became chair of Corrections and Juvenile Justice, I discovered that probable cause affidavits, these are affidavits that are submitted to the court in order to get a warrant issued to search someone's premises or to arrest someone. So search and arrest warrants were automatically and completely sealed and not available to the public or even to the subjects of searches, unless they wind up being a defendant in a case. In Kansas, I had our legislative research department check and see how many other states had similar practices or similar policies in place, and found that we stood alone of all 50 states in completely, absolutely, and in all cases, sealing the probable cause affidavits supporting search and arrest warrants. Just as one example, Missouri routinely released those affidavits within hours after an arrest is made with regard to arrest warrants. There are some limitations on search warrant affidavits in Missouri. So I set about fashioning a law to change that. Again, the principle that I enunciated before. The presumption should be that the public is entitled to these records, and the burden should be on the government to establish a good, sound reason to a court as to why they should not be released, or released in redacted form. The circumstance that triggered this was an incident in Johnson County where a couple's home was searched under a suspicion in a SWAT-type search. They entered a SWAT team entered the home and searched it under a false suspicion that they were growing marijuana in their home, which turned out not to be the case. The issues with that case were between the Johnson County Sheriff's Department and that family. It was the Hart family. But what disturbed me was the Harts asked at the time and afterward of the Johnson County Sheriff's Department, on what basis did they arrive at their conclusion that they put in their, that they used as a justification for the search, that the Harts were growing marijuana in their home. And they were told, we don't have to tell you that. And under the current state of Kansas law at the time, that was true. And the Harts spent $25,000 hiring a lawyer and going to court to find out what the underlying basis was for the issuance of that search warrant against them. And I thought that was wrong. So we established a system for search and arrest warrants in Kansas where the presumption is shifted now, and the public, the party searched, or the person arrested, or anyone else in the state of Kansas is entitled to see the probable cause affidavit supporting that search and arrest warrant, unless either the prosecutor or the defense counsel petitions the court within 5 days to seal the record completely or to redact parts of it for certain specific enumerated reasons, like an ongoing criminal investigation or protection of a confidential source. Those sorts of very specific, good reasons why law enforcement should object to disclosure of the document. And we got that enacted into law. I would like to see that system extended to all criminal investigation records in the state of Kansas, including criminal investigation reports like those involved in the Randy Leach case. I would like to see it extended to body cam footage and dashboard cam footage as well, because what limits their release now is the fact that they were included in the definition of criminal investigation records, which are generally almost completely exempt from disclosure by law enforcement. Again, the presumption should be disclosure unless law enforcement petitions the court for a specific justifiable reason, one of the enumerated reasons, like we have for probable cause affidavits, why it should not be released or redacted and then released. That's what I'd like to see happen.
Let's jump to a couple of questions in the audience. Steve Waugh, we'll bring you a microphone.
Oh boy. Steve Waugh from here in Topeka. My original question was going to be, how fast can we get rid of Got and Go? From the outside looking in, and I consider myself a reasonably well-informed person, from the outside looking in, it looks like it's a crutch for either lazy legislators or reasons for opposition not being allowed to the table, okay? Neither of those are very good things. This evening so far, I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you all doing this. I especially appreciate Mr. Probst, who's the new guy on the block, because he's got a great I think. So, given the inertia that exists in any kind of organization, and this goes back to Senator Weigel's point of process, fixing process takes a long time. Maybe changing Got and Go or taking it out immediately isn't the right thing to do, but there's got to be something better than the way it's being applied now. Because from the outside looking in, it's a complete shock to most of us when that happens, and distressing. It's not, in my opinion, very good legislation, not a good tool as it's sometimes applied.
Jump ball. Representative Probst, the new guy on the block. Your turn.
So I introduced this legislation. I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I have a lot of support for it because of exactly what you described. And I see some of that. And another lawmaker said, well, this is the tool I use, and I don't get rid of tools. I don't get rid of tools at home, and I don't get rid of tools here. And I said, yeah, it's a tool, and I get that, but it's a butter knife. And you're using a butter knife to serve as a screwdriver, a pry bar, and a paint scraper all at once. We've all done that, right? Where you don't find the right tool and just do that. And that's what it is. It's a tool that should, like, if you're in a real pinch and you're weak, it's the only thing left to you, maybe you use it. But outside of that, we've got to, I feel like, I mean, I would even be willing to say, okay, maybe it's not a banning altogether, but if we're going to use it, there ought to be some clear process, like a red flag that goes up and says, this is what we've done here, just so everyone knows. If we really think that's the only way we're going to get this done, then here's this big red warning sign that says this was a Got and Go. But right now, I had to research, do some work, and look at bills that were passed last year. There were 104 laws that came out of the legislature last year, and about a quarter of them, the contents of the original bill do not match the version that was passed. And I haven't had time to go through conference committee reports to see exactly what's in there. But there was an Open Meetings Act that became a bill on sexually violent predators. There was, just there are examples. And some of them are good, like we discussed. And some of them brought about the child review of the task force for child welfare. But some of them are bad. One of them was, started out with tagging vehicles for water districts and ended up a big bill, I mean, it was legislation about Medicaid. The very simple, the first version of this bill was a line change that added water districts, rural water districts, can tag their vehicles the same way the colleges do. They took all that content out and put a pretty sweeping bill in about Medicaid and how that's handled. That's the sort of thing I really wanted to stop. Like that is, and if there needs to be a process, the thing about process though too is that if you come into a system and the guy that trains you did it a certain way, he's gonna train you, and then you're gonna train the next guy, and you're gonna train the next guy. And somewhere along the line, somebody has to say, well, why are we doing that way? And we've all worked at places where they say, well, that's just because we want to do it that way. That does not mean it's the best way. So somewhere along the lines, we have to at least say, I'm not sure that this is how we should be doing this. And maybe I'm not gonna take this, maybe we don't need to stop it altogether, but we definitely need to evaluate why we're doing it. And as you said, make sure it's not just for inertia.
Senator Kelly?
Yeah, if I could tell you, the funniest got to go, I don't know if it's funny or not, but several years ago, the chair of our utilities committee is standing up, carrying a bill about abortion. And how that ever got into a utilities bill was, we could not figure that out. But, so I agree, the gut and go does look ugly. And I wouldn't mind if we get rid of it, as long as we think clearly about the ramifications of doing that and put other fixes in, because it really will strip any power that the loyal opposition has. Remember that everything gets to the floor at the mercy of leadership. So, if like Medicaid expansion, it's something most people in Kansas want us to do, we would not have been able to do that without gut and go. So if we're going to get rid of that procedure, we need to make sure we look very closely at everything else and figure out a way that folks who don't have the power have the opportunity to at least get a fair debate on legislation they're interested in.
I have a couple of comments, if you don't mind. First of all, let's little perspective. Gut and go is a relatively new concept in Kansas. People can tell you when it happened, and it was in the late 80s. When the first time somebody said, we're going to take the contents of one bill and throw it in the trash and put the contents of another bill in. And it wasn't used very often in the beginning. It has become an epidemic now. There are a couple of things we can do that would improve it so that it's only used in a way that's transparent. One is don't let them do it in committees, because committees are much harder. At any one time, at 9, 1:30, or 3:30, there's a half a dozen or 10 committees meeting. Very hard to keep track of what's going on in all those committees. You shouldn't use gut and go in committees ever, okay? And if you're going to, on the floor, it's much different, because on the floor, it's in public. There's always 3 or 4 media people there. You clearly know who's doing it. You clearly know what bill's being used. You clearly know what ID is being substituted in. And I agree, and like I said, that is a tool that we were able to use to do something that I think the vast majority of Kansas want to be done, which is Medicaid expansion. I think a better idea is for the majority party to let ideas they don't agree with get to the floor for debate, so we don't have to use tools like that. That's a way better way to do it than a gut and go. Let the process work. Don't set committees up so that only a group of one of the 3 parties in Kansas, extreme conservative, moderate Republican, moderate Democrats, gets to make decisions. Make the committee fair so that the bills get out of committee and we have a debate and the chips fall where they may based on the merits of the idea. That's a way to get away from gut and go, so we don't have to use it as one of our tools to get the loyal opposition ideas out in the public. And in the case of Medicaid expansion, the majority view.
Senator White?
All of you have known a number of, you're very politically active, I can tell, I see you nodding your heads, and you're out here tonight. We have a very diverse legislature. We have people from different areas of the state, and they have very diverse backgrounds. And the House has 125 people in it. It's a very unique body, and we have a Senate of 40, and are operating in different worlds. And when session starts, the House, we look over at the House, we go, why'd you pass that bill? And they're doing their work, and there is no communication with the Senate. At the same time, we're working our bills, and there's no communication with the House. And at the end of session, we come into a situation, and we realize, oh, wait a minute. There's a bill that the House passed that the people want. And that's when we take that bill that's passed one side, and we take a bill that nobody cared about, and we put it in there. As I stated, a got and go has to be a bill that in the rules at the end of session that's already passed one House. In your Medicaid expansion example, that was an amendment on the floor.
Yes, ma'am.
And we debate, I refuse to squelch debate. We allow debate, we allow amendments, and I don't tell my chairs what to do. They put the bills out that the public wants. So we're not trying to cover anything up. We have a 90-day session, and we don't start talking between the House and the Senate until that last couple weeks. And a lot of times we find out the House had a bill we liked that it should pass, and somewhere it got stuck, and I wasn't tracking it, or the Senate passed a bill. And that's how and usually it's very good bills, and that's why we put them in a bill, and everybody has to agree to it. It has to have a majority of the House, a majority of the Senate to get on to the governor. So it's not a big secretive thing. It's something that's already passed one body. And it's just because of our nature of poor communication. I mean, we are on opposite sides of the Capitol. Don's in leadership. We try to talk every once in a while. And just because it's so overwhelming and so much has to be done in such a compact time, that's how it evolved. It's not to try and be secret. It's so that we can pass bills that people want, that have already passed one body and we overlooked it. It's a 90-day session from a citizen legislature with people who really want to serve the public. We want to do the right thing. We're not trying to hide anything.
May I just real quickly say one other
Yes.
thing? You've heard the gut and go process in Kansas referred to as a tool, sometimes a useful tool. Well, it's a tool that many, and I believe I'm correct in saying most other states don't use at all, and many state legislators have never even heard of. And as Representative Ward said, it was a tool that was not even used in Kansas until the 1980s, and still the public business gets done.
Let's take another question from the audience. Steve Vogel.
Hello, I'm Steve Vogel from Tecumseh. My question's about DCF. Why have these problems been going on so long? What's being done about them? What needs to be done about them? And is there, I think you touched on this, but is there anything like an inspector general that can oversee what's going on in that department?
I'm trying to get one. This has been a passion of mine for about 5 years. In my other life, I'm an attorney, and I've been a district attorney, and I've also served in juvenile court. I've done all the jobs. I've been a prosecutor. I've been a guardian ad litem. I represent parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and siblings. There are things that we can do to DCF immediately. One is get those records when children are killed or significantly abused and have oversight of that. Two, in Kansas, we privatized the service team of DCF about 20 years ago under Governor Briggs. We had 5 contractors that covered the state of 2.8 million people, and they were all over. When Governor Brownback came to town, he collapsed that to 2 contracts and put in 2 new groups, and they've had a difficult time with challenging cases and the volume of cases. We should look at 1, whether that privatization is still good, and 2, whether we need to have more contractors. The third thing we need to do is make sure the resources are there to have the social workers review the files and do the checking on foster families and placements that hasn't been going on. And 4, we have to have commitment from the top, the governor's office and the secretary's office, that the job of DCF is to protect these children who have already been traumatized, and I think we lost that in the last couple of years.
Senator Kelly.
Yeah, thank you very much. One thing the legislature did do this year was create the Child Welfare System Task Force. And we did it differently together and talk about the issue as if we know anything about the issue. So this time we really limited it. We limited it to 6 legislators who were key on Public Health and Welfare Committee in the Senate and the Children and Seniors Committee in the House. And then we asked the Supreme Court Chief Justice to appoint 2 folks from the Citizen Review Board and from CASA. And then we asked the Judicial Administration folks to appoint the rest, so that we got guardian ad litems on here, we've got judges on here, we have social workers on here, we have parents on here, we have foster parents on here. So we have sitting around that room people with actual expertise and experience in this world. And one of the things we did in December was we actually went back to when Kansas privatized. We're actually under court order back in the 90s to do something. And at that point, Governor Graves decided that the best thing to do would be to privatize, because we certainly were doing a horrible job ourselves. So they did set up the privatized system. And quite honestly, for a long time it worked. It has started to disintegrate. We have a record number of children in foster care now. It's up from 4,000 something to over 7,000. There's a whole host of reasons for that. One, those tax cuts in 2012, had a ripple down effect, and we decimated those agencies. So there are not enough social workers to oversee the work to be done. There's not enough people in Child Protective Services to go out and investigate, do all of those kinds of things. And there's not enough people to provide proper oversight for the contractors, for the private contractors. So I'm not ready to blame the contractors for the problems within PCF. I think we just have too many problems ourselves within our own agency. And through the process of this task force, that's what we hope to uncover. We hope to figure out where the problems are and what the solutions might be, and then set up a plan to implement as resources allow.
Here's something I've learned about privatization of governmental functions. There are 2 main examples that I can point to that have been highly visible in the 10 years I've been in the legislature, and that's privatization of the foster care system and privatization of Medicare, or Medicaid, which is now known as CanCare. And what I've concluded from that is, if you privatize, there's an elevated need for oversight. And in both of those cases, we've established legislative oversight committees to do exactly that. But it's also needed on the part of the administration. If you're going to put someone in charge of a governmental function that's driven by the profit motive, there's an elevated need to watch what they're doing. Make sure they're doing what they promised in the way of delivering services, and make sure that that's the best use of the taxpayer dollars. I'm not saying it can't work, but you need to watch what's going on.
If I could add just one thing on your question on the Inspector General. We created an office of the Inspector General a while ago, filled it, the guy was totally unqualified, very quickly. And most recently moved into the Attorney General's office, and he resides there, and I believe somebody's been hired to fill that position. But the other, maybe even more critical positions that we really haven't had are independent ombudsmen, who can advocate on behalf of the folks in the system. We really don't have foster parents or families who have had their children taken out of their home. There's no place for them to turn to get help. And we've done that not only in our foster care program, but also in our Medicaid program. Again, there's no independent ombudsman, so there's no way to advocate for those folks and help them work through the system. We really need to change that.
We're running short on time. Before we run out of time, I want to talk a little bit about leadership. And at our last town hall in Olathe, readers asked what can be done to change the culture of secrecy in Topeka. And one of our panelists, who happens to be one of our panelists tonight, John Rubin, gave a one-word answer, leadership. And he expanded his answer then and said, it is in the interest of leadership to control, to enhance their power to control legislation as much as they can. And he challenged leadership in Topeka to be more transparent. And so, Senator Weigel, Representative Hyman, I want to give you a chance to respond to Representative Rubin's assessment.
I'll say that the first 8 years of my legislative experience was one where leadership ruled with an iron fist and tried to control the process when Speaker Reichman and I took office a little over a year ago, we were committed to trusting the process and letting it work. There's probably still room for improvement, and there's certainly some risk in doing that, because you're giving up some control of the process. But if you trust the process, people appreciate it, and I think the end result, in terms of the legislation that you produce, is a better one.
I agree. I'm a Republican. Right now in the Kansas Senate, we have 9 Democrats and 31 Republicans, but the Democrats and Republicans work together on issues all the time. And there's been many times when I've crossed the line and voted with the Democrats. So it's not partisan. I don't try to squelch things, and my leadership team and I don't use our positions to be secretive. We're very open, and good bills bubble to the top. You know, when something gets hung up, it's usually because there's a problem. And that's how I was going to tell Representative Probst, if a water bill became a Medicaid bill, go look for that Medicaid bill and see where that started out. I mean, you're tracing a water bill. Usually what's happened is it's somehow another good bill was blocked somewhere along the process because we have deadlines. We have deadlines. The bill has to be out of committee by a certain day. It has to be passed on the floor by a certain day. And if it's not done, it just dies. And so it's a way of bringing back a good idea that somehow the House and the Senate just let a bill die that was a good idea, and the other side says, wait a minute, what happened to this bill? We're not coordinating to kill bills. We're not coordinating to be secret. We're trying to make the best ideas become public and become law. So my leadership team and I don't suppress initiatives or suppress legislation.
Representative Probst, I'll give you the last word on this as the new voice in the legislature. What would you like to see from leadership to increase transparency in government?
I have some real questions about if what I just heard is actually true. There are a number of people that will talk about how bills cannot get out of committee. There are committee chairs that have their own bills that they're going to push through. There's a lot of talk even in the House this week about respect the committee process, and there's been comments on the House floor about one side says respect the committee process, and another guy spoke from the podium of the House that the chair of that committee told him that he was not going to have a hearing on that bill. And that's on the record. That's out there. This is happening. We have in this state one very dominant party that has, and the minority party made strides last year, but the previous years, we had a very dominant major party. And as Mr. Hyman pointed out, Representative Hyman pointed out, you had a leader, speaker, who was, by all accounts, very heavy-handed. And if he didn't want a bill to come out, it didn't come out. Some of these good ideas don't bubble to the surface because they have a block put on them.
Clearly we have more to discuss. Perhaps we'll sort some of this out in the Facebook Live after show. But we're just about out of time. I want to thank our panelists for joining us for an informative and constructive conversation about government secrecy. I want to thank everyone who joined us here in Topeka and everyone who watched on Facebook Live as well. And the Star will continue to report on this issue. On the editorial board, we'll continue to advocate for more transparency in Kansas government, and we hope you will too. Stay tuned, and good night.